Part 3. The Ontological Shift of Hermeneutics Guided by Language. Chapter 5. Language and Hermeneutics. Section 3. Language as Horizon of a Hermeneutic Ontology. Language as Experience of the World. We have considered in depth some phases of the history of the problem of language in order to present certain points of view that are remote from the modern philosophy and science of language. Since Herder and Humboldt, modern thinking about language has been governed by a quite different interest. It tries to study the way in which natural language unfolds in the range of experience of differences between human languages, an insight painfully won against the forces of rationalism and orthodoxy. Regarding every language as an organism, it undertakes a comparative study of the large variety of means which the human mind has used to exercise its capacity for language. Nicholas of Cusa was still a long way from this kind of empirical comparative inquiry. He remained a Platonist, since for him, differences within the inexact imply no truth of their own, and hence are deserving of interest only insofar as they are in agreement with the true. For him, the national peculiarities of the emergent national languages are without interest. In this respect, he differed from Wilhelm von Humboldt, for example. If we are to do justice to this founder of the modern philosophy of language, however, we must beware of the over-resonance created by comparative linguistics and the psychology of peoples that Humboldt inaugurated. With him, the problem of the truth of the word is not yet entirely obscured. Humboldt does not examine the empirical variety of the structure of human language merely in order to penetrate the individual peculiarities of different peoples by means of this tangible field of human expression. His interest in individuality, like that of his age, is not to be regarded as a turning away from the universality of the concept. Rather, for him there exists an indissoluble connection between individuality and universal nature. Together with the feeling of individuality, the sense of a totality is given as well, and so the study of the individuality of linguistic phenomena is itself intended as a means of insight into the whole of human language. He starts from the position that languages are the products of man's mental power. Wherever there is language, the originary verbal power of the human mind is at work, and every language is capable of attaining the general goal toward which this natural power of man is directed. This does not preclude, but rather legitimates the fact that comparing languages calls for a criterion of perfection according to which they are differentiated. For the effort to realize the idea of the perfect language is common to all languages, and the business of the linguist is to investigate to what extent and with what means the various languages approximate this idea. For Humboldt, then, there are undoubtedly differences in the perfection of the various languages, but he does not force a preconceived criterion on the variety of phenomena he is studying. Rather, he derives this criterion from the inner nature of language itself and its rich variety. Thus, his normative interest in comparing the structure of human languages does not get in the way of acknowledging the individuality, and that means the relative perfection, of each language. It is well known that Humboldt taught that every language should be seen as a particular view of the world, and he investigated the inner form in which the originary event of human language formation is, in each instance, differentiated. Behind this view there lies not only idealistic philosophy, which emphasizes the part played by the subject in understanding the world, but also the metaphysics of individuality first developed by Leibniz. This is expressed both in the concept of mental power, which is the corollary of the phenomenon of language, and especially in Humboldt's claim that this mental power, that is, the interior sense of language, differentiates not only sounds but also whole languages. He speaks of the individuality of intimate sense in the phenomenon, and means by this the energy of the power by means of which the inner sense acts on the sound. To him, it is self-evident that this energy cannot be everywhere the same. Thus, as we see, he shares the principle of the Enlightenment, namely, to see the principle of individuation in the approach to the true and the perfect. It is the monadological universe of Leibniz, of which the differences in the structure of human language are a part. The path of investigation that Humboldt follows is characterized by abstraction down to form. Although Humboldt revealed the significance of human languages as mirrors of the individual mentalities of the nations, nevertheless he thereby limited the universality of the connection between language and thought to the formalism of a faculty. Humboldt sees the main significance of the problem when he says that language is really situated in relation to an infinite and truly boundless sphere, the epitome of everything that can be thought. Thus, it must make an infinite use of finite means and is able to do so through the identity of the faculty that generates thoughts and language. The actual essence of a faculty that is aware of itself is to be able to make infinite use of finite means. It embraces everything on which it can act. Thus, the linguistic faculty is also superior to any content to which it can be applied. Hence, as the formalism of a faculty, it can always be detached from the determinate content of what is said. To this Humboldt owes brilliant insights, especially since he does not fail to see that, however limited the power of the individual, when compared with the might of language, there is a reciprocal relationship between the individual and language which allows man a certain freedom with respect to language. That this freedom is limited he is aware, inasmuch as every language has a life of its own, vis-a-vis what is said at any given time, so that in it one vividly senses the way in which the distant past is still connected with the feeling of the present, since language has passed through the sensations of earlier generations and has preserved their inspiration. In language conceived as form, Humboldt has still been able to perceive the historical life of the mind. To base the phenomenon of language on the concept of a linguistic faculty gives the concept of inner form a special legitimacy justified by the historical vicissitudes of the life of language. Nevertheless, this concept of language constitutes an abstraction that has to be reversed for our purposes. Verbal form and traditionary content cannot be separated in the hermeneutic experience. If every language is a view of the world, it is so not primarily because it is a particular type of language, in the way that linguists view language, but because of what is said or handed down in this language. An example will illustrate how the problem is shifted, or rather, comes into the right focus, when the unity between language and tradition is acknowledged. Wilhelm von Humboldt once remarked that to learn a foreign language involves acquiring a new standpoint in regard to one's previous worldview. And he went on to say, "Only because we always more or less totally carry over our own worldview, even our own language view, into a foreign language is this achievement not experienced in a pure and perfect way." What is here considered a limitation and a shortcoming, and rightly so from the point of view of the linguist, who is concerned with his own way of knowledge, is in fact the way hermeneutical experience is consummated. It is not learning a foreign language as such, but its use, whether in conversation with its speakers or in the study of its literature, that gives one a new standpoint on one's previous worldview. However thoroughly one may adopt a foreign frame of mind, one still does not forget one's worldview and language view. Rather, the other world we encounter is not only foreign, but is also related to us. It has not only its own truth in itself, but also its own truth for us. The other world that is experienced here is not simply an object of research and knowledge. Someone who exposes himself to the literary tradition of a foreign language so that it comes to speak to him has no objective relationship to the language as such, any more than has the traveler who uses it. He has quite a different attitude from the philologist to whom linguistic tradition is material for the history of language and comparative linguistics. We know this only too well from our experience of learning foreign languages and the strange way that the works of literature our teachers used to introduce us to these languages got killed in the process. Obviously, we cannot understand a traditionary work if we thematize the language as such. But the other side of the question, which must not be ignored, is that it is impossible to understand what the work has to say if it does not speak into a familiar world that can find a point of contact with what the text says. Thus, to learn a language is to increase the extent of what one can learn. Only on the reflective level of the linguist could one imagine saying that this point of contact prevents the achievement of learning a foreign language from being experienced in a pure and perfect way. The hermeneutical experience is exactly the reverse of this. To have learned a foreign language and to be able to understand it, this formalism of a faculty means nothing else than to be in a position to accept what is said in it as said to oneself. The exercise of this capacity for understanding always means that what is said has a claim over one, and this is impossible if one's own worldview and language view is not also involved. It would be worth investigating the extent to which Humboldt's own actual familiarity with the literary traditions of different peoples played a part in his abstract concern with language as such. His real importance for the problem of hermeneutics lies elsewhere, namely in showing that a language view is a worldview. He recognized that the living act of speech, verbal energia, is the essence of language, and thus overcame the dogmatism of the grammarians. On the basis of the concept of mental power, which dominates all his thinking about language, he was able to correctly formulate the question of the origin of language, which had been weighed down with theological considerations. He showed how mistaken this question is if it implies a human world without language, which subsequently emerged into language somehow at some time in the past. By contrast, Humboldt rightly emphasized that language was human from its very beginning. This not only alters the meaning of the question of the origin of language, it is the basis of a far-reaching anthropological insight. Language is not just one of man's possessions in the world. Rather, on it depends the fact that man has a world at all. The world as world exists for man as for no other creature that is in the world. But this world is verbal in nature. This is the real heart of Humboldt's assertion, which he intended quite differently, that languages are worldviews. By this, Humboldt means that language maintains a kind of independent life, vis-a-vis the individual member of a linguistic community. And as he grows into it, it introduces him to a particular orientation and relationship to the world as well. But the ground of this statement is more important, namely that language has no independent life apart from the world that comes to language within it. Not only is the world only insofar as it comes into language, but language too has its real being only in the fact that the world is presented in it. Thus, that language is originarily human means, at the same time that man's being in the world is primordially linguistic. We will have to investigate the relation between language and world in order to attain the horizon adequate to the fact that hermeneutic experience is verbal in nature. To have a world means to have an orientation toward it. To have an orientation toward the world, however, means to keep oneself so free from what one encounters of the world that one can present it to oneself as it is. This capacity is at once to have a world and to have language. The concept of world is thus opposed to the concept of environment, which all living beings in the world possess. It is true that the concept of environment was first used for the purely human world, and for it alone. The environment is the milieu in which man lives, and its importance consists in its influence on his character and way of life. Man is not independent of the particular aspect that the world shows him. Thus, the concept of environment is originally a social concept that tries to express the individual's dependence on society, i.e., it is related only to man. In a broad sense, however, this concept can be used to comprehend all the conditions on which a living creature depends. But it is thus clear that man, unlike all other living creatures, has a world, for other creatures do not in the same sense have a relationship to the world, but are, as it were, embedded in their environment. Thus, extending the concept of environment to all living things has in fact changed its meaning. Moreover, unlike all other living creatures, man's relationship to the world is characterized by freedom from environment. This freedom implies the linguistic constitution of the world. Both belong together. To rise above the pressure of what impinges on us from the world means to have language and to have world. It is in this form that recent philosophical anthropology, in its confrontation with Nietzsche, has worked out the special position of man and shown that the verbal constitution of the world is far from meaning that man's relationship to the world is imprisoned within a verbally schematized environment. On the contrary, wherever language and men exist, there is not only a freedom from the pressure of the world, but this freedom from the environment is also freedom in relation to the names that we give things, as stated in the profound account in Genesis, according to which God gave Adam the authority to name creatures. Once we realize the full importance of this, it becomes clear why man has a multiplicity of diverse languages, as well as a general verbal relationship to the world. Man's freedom in relation to the environment is the reason for his free capacity for speech, and also for the historical multiplicity of human speech in relation to the one world. When myth speaks of a primal language and the subsequent confusion of languages, this idea meaningfully reflects the genuine riddle that the multiplicity of languages presents for reason. But in what it says, this mythical account turns things on their head when it conceives mankind as originally unified in using an original language later sundered in a confusion of languages. The truth is that because man can always rise above the particular environment in which he happens to find himself, and because his speech brings the world into language, he is, from the beginning, free for variety in exercising his capacity for language. To rise above the environment has from the outset a human, i.e., a verbal significance. Animals can leave their environment and move over the whole earth without severing their environmental dependence. For man, however, rising above the environment means rising to world itself, to true environment. This does not mean that he leaves his habitat, but that he has another posture toward it, a free, distanced orientation that is always realized in language. Animals have a language only by analogy, for language is a human possibility that is free and variable in its use. For man, language is variable not only in the sense that there are foreign languages that one can learn, but also variable in itself, for it contains various possibilities for saying the same thing. Even in exceptional cases like deaf and dumb language, there is not a real expressive language of gesture, but a substitution of an articulated use of gesture that represents articulated vocalized language. Animals do not have this variability when making themselves understood to one another. This means, ontologically, that they make themselves understood, but not about matters of fact, the epitome of which is the world. Aristotle saw this with full clarity. Whereas the call of animals induces particular behavior in the members of the species, men's coming to a linguistic understanding with one another through the logos reveals the existent itself. From the relation of language to world follows its unique factualness, Sachlichkeit. It is matters of fact that come into language. That a thing behaves in various ways permits one to recognize its independent otherness, which presupposes a real distance between the speaker and the thing. That something can foreground itself as a genuine matter of fact and become the content of an assertion that others can understand depends on this distance. In the structure of a matter of fact that foregrounds itself, there is always a negative aspect as well. To be this and not that constitutes the determinacy of all beings. Fundamentally, therefore, there are also negative matters of fact. This is the aspect of language that Greek philosophy conceived for the first time. Even in the silent monotony of the Eleatic principle of the association of being and noein, Greek thought followed the fundamental factualness of language. And then, in overcoming the Eleatic conception of being, Plato saw the element of non-being and being as what really made it possible to speak of the existent at all. In the elaborate articulation of the logos of the eidos, the question of the real being of language could not be properly developed, since Greek thought was so full of the sense of the factualness of language. By pursuing the natural experience of the world in its linguistic form, it conceives the world as being. Whatever it conceives as existent emerges as logos, as an expressible matter of fact, from the surrounding whole that constitutes the world horizon of language. What is thus conceived of as existing is not really the object of statements, but it comes to language in statements. It thereby acquires its truth, its being evident in human thought. Thus, Greek ontology is based on the factualness of language, in that it conceives the essence of language in terms of statements. On the other hand, however, it must be emphasized that language has its true being only in dialogue, in coming to an understanding. This is not to be understood as if that were the purpose of language. Coming to an understanding is not a mere action, a purposeful activity, a setting up of signs through which I transmit my will to others. Coming to an understanding as such, rather, does not need any tools, in the proper sense of the word. It is a life process in which a community of life is lived out. To that extent, coming to an understanding through human conversation is no different from the understanding that occurs between animals. But human language must be thought of as a special and unique life process since, in linguistic communication, world is disclosed. Reaching an understanding in language places a subject matter before those communicating like a disputed object set between them. Thus, the world is the common ground, trodden by none and recognized by all, uniting all who talk to one another. All kinds of human community are kinds of linguistic community. Even more, they form language. For language is by nature the language of conversation. It fully realizes itself only in the process of coming to an understanding. That is why it is not a mere means in that process. For this reason, invented systems of artificial communication are never languages. For artificial languages, such as secret languages or systems of mathematical symbols, have no basis in a community of language or life. They are introduced and applied only as means and tools of communication. For this reason, they always presuppose a prior agreement, which is that of language. It is well known that the consensus by which an artificial language is introduced necessarily belongs to another language. In a real community of language, on the other hand, we do not first decide to agree, but are always already in agreement, as Aristotle showed. The object of understanding is not the verbal means of understanding as such, but rather the world that presents itself to us in common life, and that embraces everything about which understanding can be reached. Agreeing about a language is not the paradigmatic case, but rather a special case. Agreeing about an instrument, a system of signs, that does not have its being in dialogue but serves rather to convey information. The fact that human experience of the world is verbal in nature broadens the horizon of our analysis of hermeneutical experience. What we saw in the case of translation and the possibility of communication across the frontiers of our own languages is confirmed. The verbal world in which we live is not a barrier that prevents knowledge of being in itself, but fundamentally embraces everything in which our insight can be enlarged and deepened. It is true that those who are brought up in a particular linguistic and cultural tradition see the world in a different way from those who belong to other traditions. It is true that the historical worlds that succeed one another in the course of history are different from one another and from the world of today. But in whatever tradition we consider it, it is always a human, i.e., verbally constituted, world that presents itself to us. As verbally constituted, every such world is of itself always open to every possible insight and hence to every expansion of its own world picture, and is accordingly available to others. This is of fundamental importance, for it makes the expression world in itself problematical. The criterion for the continuing expansion of our own world picture is not given by a world in itself that lies beyond all language. Rather, the infinite perfectibility of the human experience of the world means that whatever language we use, we never succeed in seeing anything but an ever more extended aspect, a view of the world. Those views of the world are not relative in the sense that one could oppose them to the world in itself, as if the right view from some possible position outside the human, linguistic world could discover it in its being in itself. No one doubts that the world can exist without man, and perhaps will do so, This is part of the meaning in which every human, linguistically constituted view of the world lives. In every worldview, the existence of the world in itself is intended. It is the whole to which linguistically schematized experience refers. The multiplicity of these worldviews does not involve any relativization of the world. Rather, the world is not different from the views in which it presents itself. The relationship is the same in the perception of things. Seen phenomenologically, the thing in itself is, as Husserl has shown, nothing but the continuity with which the various perceptual perspectives on objects shade into one another. A person who opposes being in itself to these aspects must think either theologically, in which case the being in itself is not for him, but only for God, or he will think like Lucifer, like one who wants to prove his own divinity by the fact that the whole world has to obey him. In this case, the world's being in itself is a limitation of the omnipotence of his imagination. In the same way as with perception, we can speak of the linguistic shadings that the world undergoes in different language worlds. But there remains a characteristic difference. Every shading of the object of perception is exclusively distinct from every other, and each helps co-constitute the thing in itself as the continuum of these nuances, whereas, in the case of the shadings of verbal worldviews, each one potentially contains every other one within it, i.e., each worldview can be extended into every other. It can understand and comprehend, from within itself, the view of the world presented in another language. Thus we hold, the fact that our experience of the world is bound to language does not imply an exclusiveness of perspectives. If, by entering foreign language worlds, we overcome the prejudices and limitations of our previous experience of the world, this does not mean that we leave and negate our own world. Like travelers, we return home with new experiences. Even if we emigrate and never return, we still can never wholly forget. Even if, as people who know about history, we are fundamentally aware that all human thought about the world is historically conditioned, and thus are aware that our own thought is conditioned too, we still have not assumed an unconditional standpoint. In particular, it is no objection to affirming that we are thus fundamentally conditioned to say that this affirmation is intended to be absolutely and unconditionally true, and therefore cannot be applied to itself without contradiction. The consciousness of being conditioned does not supersede our conditionedness. It is one of the prejudices of reflective philosophy that it understands matters that are not at all on the same logical level as standing in propositional relationships. Thus, the reflective argument is out of place here. For we are not dealing with relationships between judgments which have to be kept free from contradictions, but with life relationships. Our verbal experience of the world has the capacity to embrace the most varied relationships of life. Thus, the sun has not ceased to set for us, even though the Copernican explanation of the universe has become part of our knowledge. Obviously, we can keep seeing things in a certain way, while at the same time knowing that doing so is absurd in the world of understanding. And is it not language that operates in a creative way, reconciling these stratified living relationships? When we speak of the sun setting, this is not an arbitrary phrase. It expresses what really appears to be the case. It is the appearance presented to a man who is not himself in motion. It is the sun that comes and goes as its rays reach or leave us. Thus, to our vision, the setting of the sun is a reality. It is relative to Dasein. Now, by constructing another model, we can mentally liberate ourselves from the evidence of our senses. And because we can do this, we can see things from the rational viewpoint of the Copernican theory. But we cannot try to supersede or refute natural appearances by viewing things through the eyes of scientific understanding. This is pointless not only because what we see with our eyes has genuine reality for us, but also because the truth that science states is itself relative to a particular world orientation and cannot at all claim to be the whole. But what really opens up the whole of our world orientation is language, and in this whole of language, appearances retain their legitimacy just as much as does science. Of course, this does not mean that language is the cause of this intellectual power of persistence. but only that the immediacy of our worldview and view of ourselves, in which we persist, is preserved and altered within language, because we finite beings always come from afar and stretch into the distance. In language, the reality beyond every individual consciousness becomes visible. Thus, the verbal event reflects not only what persists, but what changes in things. From the way that words change, we can discover the way that customs and values change. In the German language world, for example, the word Tugend, virtue, now nearly always has an ironic significance. If we use other words instead to discreetly express the continuance of moral norms in a world that has turned away from established conventions, then such a process is a mirror of what is real. Poetry, too, often becomes a test of what is true, in that the poem awakens a secret life in words that had seemed to be used up and worn out, and tells us of ourselves. Obviously, language can do all this because it is not a creation of reflective thought, but itself helps to fashion the world orientation in which we live. We have, then, a confirmation of what we stated above, namely that in language the world itself presents itself. Verbal experience of the world is absolute. It transcends all the relative ways being is posited because it embraces all being in itself, in whatever relationships, relativities, it appears. Our verbal experience of the world is prior to everything that is recognized and addressed as existing. That language and world are related in a fundamental way does not mean, then, that world becomes the object of language. Rather, the object of knowledge and statements is always already enclosed within the world horizon of language. That human experience of the world is verbal does not imply that a world in itself is being objectified. The world of objects that science knows, and from which it derives its own objectivity, is one of the relativities embraced by language's relation to the world. In it, the concept of being in itself acquires the character of a determination of the will. What exists in itself is independent of one's own willing and imagining, but in being known in its being in itself, it is put at one's disposal in the sense that one can reckon with it, i.e., use it for one's own purposes. As we can see, this idea of being in itself is only the apparent equivalent of the Greek concept of a thing's being as it is in itself. The latter means primarily the ontological difference between what an entity is in its substance and its essence, and what can exist in it and is subject to change. What belongs to the permanent nature of an entity can certainly always, in a preeminent sense, be known, i.e., it always has a prior association with the human mind. But what exists in itself in the sense of modern science has nothing to do with this ontological difference between the essential and the inessential. Rather, it is determined as certain knowledge which permits us to control things. The certified facts are like the object and its resistance, Widerstand, in that one has to reckon with them. What exists in itself, then, as Max Scheler has shown, is relative to a particular way of knowing and willing. This does not imply that some particular science is concerned in a special way with dominating what exists and, on the basis of this will to dominate, determining the real meaning of being in itself. Scheler rightly emphasized that the world model of mechanics is related in a special way to the capacity to make things. But the knowledge of all the natural sciences is knowledge for domination. This can be seen with particular clarity, where modern science sets new goals of research that not only try to be methodologically different from the unitary method of modern physics, but also claim to embody a different attitude to research. Thus, for example, the environmental studies of the biologist Jakob von Uexküll contrasted the world of physics to a universe of life composed of the manifold living worlds of plants, animals, and men. Such biological inquiry claims to overcome the naive anthropocentricity of the earlier study of animals by investigating the particular structures of the habitats in which living things have their being. Like animal environments, the human world is built of elements that are available to human senses. If worlds are to be thought of as biological plans, however, this not only assumes the existence of the world of being in itself that is made available through physics, in that one is working out the selective principles according to which the various creatures construct their worlds out of material that exists in itself. It also derives the biological universe from the physical universe by a kind of restyling, and it indirectly assumes the existence of the latter. Certainly, this constitutes a new kind of inquiry. It is a line of research generally known today as behavioral biology. Logically, it would embrace the human species as well. It has now developed a physics by means of which one can conceive human beings' perceptions of time and space as a special case, distinctive to a specifically human orientation, of much more complicated mathematical structures, much as today we perceive the world of bees, whose capacity to orient themselves we explain by recourse to their sensitivity to ultraviolet light. This creates the impression that the world of physics is the true world that exists in itself, the absolute reality, as it were, to which all living things are related, each in its own way. But is it really the case that this world is a world of being in itself, where all relativity to Dasein has been surpassed, and where knowledge can be called an absolute science? Is not the very concept of an absolute object a contradiction in terms? Neither the biological nor the physical universe can, in fact, deny its concrete existential relativity. In this, physics and biology have the same ontological horizon, which it is impossible for them as science to transcend. They know what is, and this means, as Kant has shown, as it is given in space and time, and is an object of experience. This even defines the progressive knowledge that science aims for. The world of physics cannot seek to be the whole of what exists, for even a world equation that contained everything, so that the observer of the system would also be included in the equations, would still assume the existence of a physicist who, as the calculator, would not be an object calculated. A physics that calculated itself and was its own calculation would be self-contradictory. The same thing is true of biology, which investigates the environments of all living things, including, therefore, the human environment. What is known in it certainly also embraces the being of the scientist, for he too is a living creature and a man. But from this it in no way follows that biological science is a mere product of life and only has meaning as such. Rather, biology studies what exists in exactly the same way as does physics. It is not itself what it studies. The being in itself toward which research, whether in physics or biology, is directed, is relative to the way being is posited in its manner of inquiry. There is not the slightest reason beyond this to admit science's metaphysical claim to know being in itself. Each science as a science has in advance projected a field of objects such that to know them is to govern them. We find quite another situation when we consider man's relationship to the world as a whole, as it is expressed in language. The world that appears in language and is constituted by it does not have in the same sense being in itself, and is not relative in the same sense as the object of the natural sciences. It is not being in itself, insofar as it is not characterized by objectivity and can never be given in experience as the comprehensive whole that it is. But as the world that it is not relative to a particular language either. For to live in a linguistic world, as one does as a member of a linguistic community, does not mean that one is placed in an environment as animals are. We cannot see a linguistic world from above in this way, for there is no point of view outside the experience of the world in language from which it could become an object. Physics does not provide this point of view, because the world, i.e., the totality of what exists, is not the object of its research and calculation. Nor does comparative linguistics, which studies the structure of languages, have any non-linguistic point of view, from which we could know the in-itself quality of what exists, and for which the various forms of the linguistic experience of the world could be reconstructed as a schematized selection from what exists in itself, in a way analogous to animal habitats, the principles of whose structure we study. Rather, every language has a direct relationship to the infinity of beings. To have language involves a mode of being that is quite different from the way animals are confined to their habitat. By learning foreign languages, men do not alter their relationship to the world, like an aquatic animal that becomes a land animal. Rather, while preserving their own relationship to the world, they extend and enrich it by the world of the foreign language. Whoever has language has the world. If we keep this in mind, we will no longer confuse the factualness, Sachlichkeit, of language with the objectivity of science. The distance involved in a linguistic relationship to the world does not, as such, produce the objectivity that the natural sciences achieve by eliminating the subjective elements of the cognitive process. The distance and the factualness of language, of course, are also genuine achievements and do not just happen automatically. We know how putting an experience into words helps us cope with it. It is as if its threatening, even annihilating immediacy is pushed into the background, brought into proportion, made communicable and hence dealt with. Such coping with experience, however, is obviously something different from the way science works on it, objectivizing it and making it available for whatever purposes it likes. Once a scientist has discovered the law of a natural process, he has it in his power. No such thing is possible in the natural experience of the world expressed in language. Using language by no means involves making things available and calculable. It is not just that the statement or judgment is merely one particular form among the many other linguistic orientations. They themselves remain bound up with man's life orientation. Consequently, objectivizing science regards the linguisticality of the natural experience of the world as a source of prejudices. With its methods of precise mathematical measurement, the new science, as we learn from the example of Bacon, had to make room for its own constructs by directly opposing the prejudice of language and its naive teleology. On the other hand, there is a positive connection between the factualness of language and man's capacity for science. This becomes especially clear in ancient science, whose specific merit and specific weakness was that it originated in the linguistic experience of the world. In order to overcome this weakness, its naive anthropocentrism, modern science has also renounced its merit, namely its place in man's natural world orientation. The concept of theory can illustrate this very well. It would seem that what modern science calls theory has scarcely anything to do with the way the Greeks approached seeing and knowing the order of the world. Modern theory is a tool of construction, by means of which we gather experiences together in a unified way and make it possible to dominate them. We are said to construct a theory. This already implies that one theory succeeds another, and from the outset each commands only conditional validity, namely insofar as further experience does not make us change our mind. Ancient theoria, contemplative understanding, is not a means in the same sense, but the end itself, the highest manner of being human. Nevertheless, there are close connections between the two. In both cases, the practical or pragmatic interest that views whatever happens in the light of one's aims and purposes is overcome. Aristotle tells us that the theoretical attitude could emerge only when all the necessities of life were already available. Even the theoretical attitude of modern science does not direct its questions to nature for particular practical purposes. True, the manner of its questions and investigations is aimed at dominating what exists, and so must in itself be called practical. But the application of his knowledge is secondary in the mind of the individual scientist, in the sense that the application follows from the knowledge, yet only comes afterward, so that no one who discovers a piece of knowledge needs to know for what purpose it is to be used. Nevertheless, despite the similarities, the meaning of the words theory and theoretical is now obviously different. In modern usage, the idea of the theoretical is almost a privative idea. Something is meant only theoretically when it does not have the definitively binding quality of a goal of action. On the other hand, the projected theories themselves are dominated by the idea of construction, i.e., theoretical knowledge is itself conceived in terms of the will to dominate what exists. It is a means and not an end. Theory, in the ancient sense, however, is something quite different. There, it is not just that existing orders as such are contemplated, but theory means sharing in the total order itself. This difference between Greek contemplative understanding and modern science is based, in my opinion, on different orientations to verbal experience of the world. Greek knowledge, as I pointed out above, was so much within language, so exposed to its seductions, that its fight against the power of names never led it to develop the ideal of a pure symbolic language, whose purpose would be to overcome entirely the power of language, as is the case with modern science and its orientation toward dominating the existent. Both the letter symbols Aristotle uses in logic and his proportional and relative way of describing the course of movements in physics are obviously quite different from the way in which mathematics comes to be applied in the 17th century. We cannot ignore this fact, however much we emphasize that the Greeks were the founders of science. The days should be finally past when modern scientific method was taken as a criterion, when Plato was interpreted in terms of Kant, the idea in terms of natural law, or when Democritus was praised as the founder of the true, mechanical knowledge of nature. We have only to consider Hegel's fundamental refutation of the rationalist position by means of the idea of life, in order to see the limitations of this approach. As F see it, in Being and Time, Heidegger attains a position from which both the differences and the similarities between Greek science and modern science can be considered. When he showed that the concept of presence at hand is a deficient mode of being and viewed it as the background of classical metaphysics and its continuance in the modern concept of subjectivity, he was pursuing an ontologically correct connection between Greek theoria and modern science. Within the horizon of his temporal interpretation of being, classical metaphysics as a whole is an ontology of the present at hand, and modern science is, unbeknownst to itself, its heir. But in Greek theoria, there was undoubtedly another element as well. Theoria grasps not so much the present at hand as the thing itself, which still has the dignity of a thing. The later Heidegger himself emphasized that the experience of the thing has as little to do with merely establishing simple presence at hand as with the experience of the so-called experimental sciences. Thus, we must keep the dignity of the thing and the referentiality of language free from the prejudice originating in the ontology of the present at hand, as well as in the concept of objectivity. Our starting point is that verbally constituted experience of the world expresses not what is present at hand, that which is calculated or measured, but what exists, what man recognizes as existent and significant. The process of understanding practiced in the moral sciences can recognize itself in this, and not in the methodological ideal of rational construction that dominates modern mathematically based natural science. If we said that historically affected consciousness is realized in language, this was because language characterizes our human experience of the world in general. As little as world is objectified in language, so little is historical effect the object of hermeneutical consciousness. Just as things, those units of our experience of the world that are constituted by their suitability and their significance, are brought into language, so the tradition that has come down to us is again brought to speak in our understanding and interpretation of it. The linguistic nature of this bringing into language is the same as that of the human experience of the world in general. This is what has finally led our analysis of the hermeneutical phenomenon to the discussion of the relationship between language and world. Language as medium and its speculative structure. That human experience of the world is linguistic in nature was the thread underlying Greek metaphysics in its thinking about being since Plato's flight into the logoi. We must inquire how far the answer given there, an answer that lasted until Hegel, does justice to the question we are concerned with. This answer is theological. In considering the being of beings, Greek metaphysics regarded it as a being that fulfilled itself in thought. This thought is the thought of nous, which is conceived as the highest and most perfect being, gathering within itself the being of all beings. The articulation of the logos brings the structure of being into language, and this coming into language is, for Greek thought, nothing other than the presenting of the being itself, its aletheia. Human thought regards the infinity of this presence as its fulfilled potential, its divinity. We do not follow this way of thinking in its splendid self-forgetfulness, and so we will have to consider to what extent we can follow its revival, based on the modern idea of subjectivity, as found in Hegel's absolute idealism. For we are guided by the hermeneutical phenomenon, and its ground, which determines everything else, is the finitude of our historical experience. In order to do justice to it, we followed the trail of language, in which the structure of being is not simply reflected. Rather, in language the order and structure of our experience itself is originally formed and constantly changed. Language is the record of finitude, not because the structure of human language is multifarious, but because every language is constantly being formed and developed, the more it expresses its experience of the world. It is finite not because it is not at once all other languages, but simply because it is language. We have considered important turning points in European thought concerning language, and from these we have learned that the event of language corresponds to the finitude of man in a far more radical sense than is brought out in Christian thinking about the word. It is from language as a medium that our whole experience of the world, and especially hermeneutical experience, unfolds. A word is not simply the perfection of the species, as medieval thought held. When a being is represented in the thinking mind, this is not the reflection of a pre-given order of being, the true nature of which is apparent to an infinite mind, that of the Creator. But neither is a word an instrument like the language of mathematics that can construct an objectified universe of beings that can be put at our disposal by calculation. No more than an infinite mind can an infinite will surpass the experience of being that is proportionate to our finitude. It is the medium of language alone that, related to the totality of beings, mediates the finite, historical nature of man to himself and to the world. Only now can the great dialectical puzzle of the one and the many, which fascinated Plato as the negation of the logos and which received a mysterious affirmation in medieval speculation on the Trinity, be given its true and fundamental ground. When Plato realized that the word of language is both one and many, he took only the first step. It is always one word that we say to one another, and that is said to us, theologically, the word of God. But the unity of this word, as we saw, always unfolds step by step in articulated discourse. This structure of the logos and the verbum, as recognized by the Platonic and Augustinian dialectic, is simply the reflection of its logical contents. But there is another dialectic of the word, which accords to every word an inner dimension of multiplication. Every word breaks forth as if from a center and is related to a whole, through which alone it is a word. Every word causes the whole of the language to which it belongs to resonate, and the whole worldview that underlies it to appear. Thus, every word, as the event of a moment, carries with it the unsaid, to which it is related by responding and summoning. The occasionality of human speech is not a casual imperfection of its expressive power. It is, rather, the logical expression of the living virtuality of speech that brings a totality of meaning into play, without being able to express it totally. All human speaking is finite in such a way that there is laid up within it an infinity of meaning to be explicated and laid out. That is why the hermeneutical phenomenon also can be illuminated only in light of the fundamental finitude of being, which is wholly verbal in character. Above, we spoke of the way the interpreter belongs to his text, and described the close relationship between tradition and history that is expressed in the concept of historically affected consciousness. We can now define more exactly the idea of belonging, on the basis of the linguistically constituted experience of world. As was to be expected, this involves us in a number of questions with which philosophy has long been familiar. In metaphysics, belonging refers to the transcendental relationship between being and truth, and it conceives knowledge as an element of being itself, and not primarily as an activity of the subject. That knowledge is incorporated in being is the presupposition of all classical and medieval thought. What is of its nature true, i.e., present before an infinite mind, and only for this reason is it possible for finite human thought to know beings. Thus, Here thought does not start from the concept of a subject that exists in its own right and makes everything else an object. On the contrary, Plato defines the being of the soul as participating in true being, i.e., as belonging to the same sphere of being as the idea, and Aristotle says that the soul is, in a certain sense, everything that exists. In this thinking there is no question of a self-conscious spirit without world, which would have to find its way to worldly being. Both belong originally to each other. The relationship is primary. Earlier thought took account of this by giving teleology a universal ontological function. In a practical context, it is not by chance that the intermediate agencies through which something is achieved prove suited to achieve the end. Rather, they are chosen from the outset as suitable means. Thus, the ordering of means to ends is prior. We call this purposiveness, and we know that not only rational human action is purposive in this way, but also, where there is no question of setting up goals and choosing means, as in all living relationships, such relationships can be conceived only within the concept of purposiveness, as the reciprocal harmony of all the parts with one another. Here, too, the whole in its relations is more original than the parts. Even in the theory of evolution, we may use the concept of adaptation only with caution, inasmuch as this theory assumes that the natural situation is one of lack of adaptation, as if creatures were placed within a world to which they had belatedly to adapt themselves. Just as being already adapted actually constitutes the creature's relation to life, so the concept of knowledge dominated by thought of ends and means is defined as the natural coordination of the human mind to the nature of things. In modern science, this metaphysical conception of how the knowing subject belongs to the object of knowledge is without justification. Its methodological ideal ensures that every one of its steps can be retraced to the elements from which its knowledge is built up, while the teleological units of significance such as thing or organic whole lose their legitimacy. In particular, the critique of the verbalism of Aristotelian and scholastic science that we touched on above dissolved the old coordination between man and world that lay at the basis of logos philosophy. But modern science has never entirely denied its Greek ancestry, however much, since the 17th century, it has become conscious of itself and of the boundless possibilities that open up before it. Descartes' real treatise on method, his rules, the veritable manifesto of modern science, did not appear, as we know, until a long time after his death. However, his thoughtful meditations on the compatibility of the mathematical knowledge of nature with metaphysics set a task for an entire age. German philosophy from Leibniz to Hegel constantly tried to supplement the new science of physics with a philosophical and speculative science in which the legacy of Aristotle would be revived and preserved. We need only recall Goethe's objection to Newton, which was shared by Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. Hence it is not surprising if, after another century of critical experiences provided by modern science, and especially by the self-awareness of the historical sciences, we again take up this legacy. If we are to do justice to the subject, the hermeneutics of the human sciences, which at first appears to be of secondary and derivative concern, a modest chapter from the heritage of German idealism, leads us back into the problems of classical metaphysics. This can be seen in the role that the concept of dialectic plays in 19th century philosophy. It testifies to the continuity of the problem from its Greek origin. When it is a question of understanding the suprasubjective powers that dominate history, the Greeks have something over us, for we are entangled in the aporius of subjectivism. They did not try to base the objectivity of knowledge on subjectivity. Rather, their thinking always regarded itself as an element of being itself. Parmenides considered this to be the most important signpost on the way to the truth of being. Dialectic, this expression of the logos, was not for the Greeks a movement performed by thought. What thought experiences is the movement of the thing itself. The fact that this sounds like Hegel does not mean that there has been any false modernization, but shows rather the historical connection. In the situation of modern thought that we have described, Hegel has consciously taken up the model of Greek dialectic. Hence, whoever wants to learn from the Greeks always has to learn from Hegel first. Both his dialectic of the determinations of thought and his dialectic of the forms of knowledge explicitly repeat the total mediation between thought and being that was formerly the natural element of Greek thought. In that our hermeneutical theory seeks to show the interconnection of event and understanding, it sends us back to Parmenides, as well as to Hegel. When we thus take the concept of belonging, which we have won from the Aporeus of historicism, and relate it to the background of general metaphysics, we are not trying to revive the classical doctrine of the intelligibility of being or apply it to the historical world. This would be a mere repetition of Hegel, which would not hold up, either in the face of Kant and the experiential standpoint of modern science, or primarily in the face of an experience of history that is no longer guided by the knowledge of salvation. We are simply following an internal necessity of the thing itself if we go beyond the idea of the object and the objectivity of understanding toward the idea that subject and object belong together. Our critique of aesthetic and historical consciousness drove us to critique the concept of the objective, to detach ourselves from the Cartesian basis of modern science, and to revive ideas from Greek thought. But we cannot simply follow the Greeks or the identity philosophy of German idealism. We are thinking out the consequences of language as medium. From this viewpoint, the concept of belonging is no longer regarded as the teleological relation of the mind to the ontological structure of what exists, as this relation is conceived in metaphysics. Quite a different state of affairs follows from the fact that the hermeneutical experience is linguistic in nature, that there is dialogue between tradition and its interpreter. The fundamental thing here is that something occurs. Neither is the mind of the interpreter in control of what words of tradition reach him, nor can one suitably describe what occurs here as the progressive knowledge of what exists, so that an infinite intellect would contain everything that could ever speak out of the whole of tradition. Seen from the point of view of the interpreter, occurrence means that he is not a knower seeking an object, discovering by methodological means what was really meant and what the situation actually was, though slightly hindered and affected by his own prejudices. This is only an external aspect of the actual hermeneutical occurrence. It motivates the indispensable methodological discipline one has toward oneself. But the actual occurrence is made possible only because the word that has come down to us as tradition and to which we are to listen really encounters us and does so as if it addressed us and is concerned with us. I have elaborated this aspect of the situation above as the hermeneutical logic of the question and shown how the questioner becomes the one who is questioned and how the hermeneutical occurrence is realized in the dialectic of the question. I recall this here in order to define correctly the meaning of belonging as it pertains to our hermeneutical experience. For on the other side, that of the object, this occurrence means the coming into play, the playing out, of the content of tradition in its constantly widening possibilities of significance and resonance, extended by the different people receiving it. Inasmuch as the tradition is newly expressed in language, something comes into being that had not existed before and that exists from now on. We can illustrate this with any historical example. Whether a given traditionary text is a poem or tells us of a great event, in each case what is transmitted re-emerges into existence just as it presents itself. There is no being in itself that is increasingly revealed when Homer's Iliad or Alexander's Indian campaign speaks to us in the new appropriation of tradition. But, as in genuine dialogue, something emerges that is contained in neither of the partners by himself. If we are trying to define the idea of belonging as accurately as possible, we must take account of the particular dialectic implied in hearing. It is not just that he who hears is also addressed, but also that he who is addressed must hear whether he wants to or not. When you look at something, you can also look away from it by looking in another direction, but you cannot hear away. This difference between seeing and hearing is important for us because the primacy of hearing is the basis of the hermeneutical phenomenon, as Aristotle saw. There is nothing that is not available to hearing through the medium of language. Whereas all the other senses have no immediate share in the universality of the verbal experience of the world, but only offer the key to their own specific fields, hearing is an avenue to the whole, because it is able to listen to the logos. In the light of our hermeneutical inquiry, this ancient insight into the priority of hearing oversight acquires a new emphasis. The language in which hearing shares is not only universal in the sense that everything can be expressed in it. The significance of the hermeneutical experience is rather that, in contrast to all other experience of the world, language opens up a completely new dimension, the profound dimension from which tradition comes down to those now living. This has always been the true essence of hearing, even before the invention of writing, that the hearer can listen to the legends, the myths, and the truth of the ancients. In comparison, the written literary transmission of tradition as we know it is nothing new. It only changes the form and makes the task of real hearing more difficult. Here the concept of belonging takes on a new definition. Belonging is brought about by traditions addressing us. Everyone who is situated in a tradition, and this is true, as we know, even of the man who is released into a new apparent freedom by historical consciousness, must listen to what reaches him from it. The truth of tradition is like the present that lies immediately open to the senses. The mode of being of tradition is, of course, not sensible immediacy. It is language, and in interpreting its texts, the hearer who understands it relates its truth to his own linguistic orientation to the world. This linguistic communication between present and tradition is, as we have shown, the event that takes place in all understanding. Hermeneutical experience must take everything that becomes present to it as a genuine experience. It does not have prior freedom to select and reject, nor can it maintain an absolute freedom by leaving undecided matters specific to what one is trying to understand. It cannot unmake the event that it is itself. This structure of the hermeneutical experience, which so totally contradicts the idea of scientific methodology, itself depends on the character of language as event that we have described at length. It is not just that the use and development of language is a process which has no single knowing and choosing consciousness standing over against it. Thus, it is literally more correct to say that language speaks us, rather than that we speak it. So that, for example, the time at which a text was written can be determined more exactly from its linguistic usage than from its author. A more important point is the one to which we have constantly referred, namely that what constitutes the hermeneutical event proper is not language as language, whether as grammar or as lexicon. It consists in the coming into language of what has been said in the tradition, an event that is at once appropriation and interpretation. Thus here it really is true to say that this event is not our action upon the thing, but the act of the thing itself. This confirms the similarity of our approach to that of Hegel in the Greek world, which we have already noted. Our inquiry started from our dissatisfaction with the modern concept of methodology. But this dissatisfaction found its most significant philosophical justification in Hegel's explicit appeal to the Greek concept of methodology. He criticized the concept of a method that dealt with the thing, but was alien to it, calling it external reflection. The true method was an action of the thing itself. This assertion does not, of course, mean that philosophical cognition is not also an activity, even an effort that calls for the effort of the concept. But this activity and this effort consist in not interfering arbitrarily, latching onto this or that ready-made notion as it strikes one, with the immanent necessity of the thought. Certainly, the thing does not go its own course without our thinking being involved, but thinking means unfolding what consistently follows from the subject matter itself. It is part of this process to suppress ideas that tend to insinuate themselves and to insist on the logic of the thought. Since the Greeks, we have called this dialectic. In describing the true method, which is the activity of the thing itself, Hegel quotes Plato, who loved to show his Socrates in conversation with young men, because they were ready to follow where Socrates' questions led, without regard for current opinions. He illustrated his own method of dialectical development by these malleable youths who did not parade their own ideas, but rather avoided obstructing the path on which the subject matter led them. Here, dialectic is nothing but the art of conducting a conversation, and especially of revealing the mistakes in one's opinions through the process of questioning and yet further questioning. Here, then, the dialectic is negative, it confuses one's opinions. But this kind of confusion means at the same time a clarification, for it opens one's eyes to the thing. Just as in the famous scene in the Meno where, after all the slave's untenable suppositions have collapsed, he is led out of his confusion to the right solution of the mathematical task he has been set, so also all dialectical negativity contains an adumbration of what is true, not only in all pedagogical dialogue, but in all thought. Only pursuing what consistently follows from the subject matter can bring out what lies in it. It is the thing itself that asserts its force, if we rely entirely on the power of thought and disregard obvious appearances and opinions. Thus, Plato linked the Eleatic dialectic, which we know chiefly from Zeno, with the Socratic art of dialogue, and raised it in his Parmenides to a new reflective level. That things change and become their opposite as one consistently thinks them through, that thought acquires the power of testing what follows from contraries without knowing the what, is the experience of thought Hegel appeals to when he conceives of method as the self-unfolding of pure thought to become the systematic whole of truth. Now, the hermeneutical experience that we are endeavoring to think from the viewpoint of language as medium is certainly not an experience of thinking in the same sense as this dialectic of the concept, which seeks to free itself entirely from the power of language. Nevertheless, there is something resembling dialectic in hermeneutical experience, an activity of the thing itself, an action that, unlike the methodology of modern science, is a passion, an understanding, an event that happens to one. The hermeneutical experience also has its own rigor, that of uninterrupted listening. A thing does not present itself to the hermeneutical experience without an effort special to it, namely that of being negative toward itself. A person who is trying to understand a text has to keep something at a distance, namely everything that suggests itself on the basis of his own prejudices as the meaning expected, as soon as it is rejected by the sense of the text itself. Even the experience of reversal, which happens unceasingly in talking, and which is the real experience of dialectic, has its equivalent here. Explicating the whole of meaning towards which understanding is directed forces us to make interpretive conjectures and to take them back again. The self-cancellation of the interpretation makes it possible for the thing itself, the meaning of the text, to assert itself. The movement of the interpretation is dialectical, not primarily because the one-sidedness of every statement can be balanced by another side. This is, as we shall see, a secondary phenomenon in interpretation, but because the word that interpretatively fits the meaning of the text expresses the whole of this meaning, i.e., allows an infinity of meaning to be represented within it in a finite way. That this is dialectic, conceived on the basis of the medium of language, needs more exact discussion, as does the way in which this dialectic differs from the metaphysical dialectic of Plato and Hegel. Following a usage that we can find in Hegel, we call what is common to the metaphysical and the hermeneutical dialectic the speculative element. The word speculative here refers to the mirror relation. Being reflected involves a constant substitution of one thing for another. When something is reflected in something else, say, the castle in the lake, it means that the lake throws back the image of the castle. The mirror image is essentially connected with the actual sight of the thing through the medium of the observer. It has no being of its own. It is like an appearance that is not itself and yet allows the thing to appear by means of a mirror image. It is like a duplication that is still only the one thing. The real mystery of a reflection is the intangibility of the image, the sheer reproduction hovering before the mind's eye. If we now use the word speculative, as it was coined by philosophers around 1800, and say, for example, that someone has a speculative mind or that a thought is rather speculative. Behind this usage lies the notion of reflection in a mirror. Speculative means the opposite of the dogmatism of everyday experience. A speculative person is someone who does not abandon himself directly to the tangibility of appearances or to the fixed determinateness of the ment, but who is able to reflect or, to put it in Hegelian terms, who sees that the in itself is a for me. And a thought is speculative if the relationship it asserts is not conceived as a quality unambiguously assigned to a subject, a property to a given thing, but must be thought of as a mirroring, in which the reflection is nothing but the pure appearance of what is reflected, just as the one is the one of the other and the other is the other of the one. Hegel has described speculative thought in his masterly analysis of the logic of the philosophical proposition. He shows that only in its external form is the philosophical proposition a judgment, i.e., a predicate ascribed to a subject concept. In fact, the philosophical proposition does not pass over from the subject concept to another concept that is placed in relation to it. It states the truth of the subject in the form of the predicate. God is one does not mean that it is a property of God's to be one, but that it is God's nature to be unity. Here, the movement of definition is not tied to the fixed base of the subject, from which it runs back and forth. The subject is not defined both as this and as that, in one respect like this, and in another like that. This would be the mode of imagistic thinking, not of the concept. In conceptual thinking, by contrast, the natural movement of definition beyond the subject of the proposition is prevented and suffers a setback, as it were. Starting from the subject, as if this remained the basis throughout, it finds that, since the predicate is rather the substance, the subject has passed into the predicate and has thus been superseded. And since what seems to be predicate has become the whole independent mass, thought cannot roam freely, but is stopped by this weight. Thus the form of the proposition destroys itself, since the speculative proposition does not state something about something. Rather, it presents the unity of the concept. The philosophical proposition has, as it were, two peaks by reason of this counterthrust of the predicate. Hegel compares it to the rhythm that follows from the two elements of meter and accent and produces the same floating harmony. The unaccustomed blockage that thought undergoes when the contents of a proposition compel thought to give up its cognitive habits constitutes, in fact, the speculative nature of all philosophy. Hegel's great history of philosophy shows that from the beginning, philosophy is speculation in this sense. If it expresses itself in the form of predication, i.e., using fixed ideas of God, soul, and world, then it fails to understand its own nature and is pursuing a one-sided view of the understanding of the objects of reason. According to Hegel, this is the nature of pre-Kantian dogmatic metaphysics and is characteristic of the modern ages of non-philosophy. Plato is certainly not such a metaphysician. Still less is Aristotle, although sometimes the contrary is thought to be true. For Hegel, the important thing is to represent expressly this inner block that thought undergoes when its habit of running away with ideas is interrupted by the concept. Non-speculative thought can, as it were, demand this. It has a valid right that is not, however, respected in the mode of the speculative proposition. What it can demand is that the dialectical self-destruction of the proposition be expressed. With other knowledge, the proof constitutes this side of expressed inwardness. But since dialectic has been separated from proof, the concept of philosophical proof has, in fact, been lost. Whatever Hegel means by this, he is, at any rate, trying to re-establish the meaning of philosophical proof. This takes place in the account of the dialectical movement of the proposition. This is what is really speculative, and speculative presentation consists in expressing this alone. The speculative relation, then, must pass into dialectical presentation. This, for Hegel, is the demand of philosophy. What is here called expression and presentation is not actually someone's act of demonstration or proof. Rather, the object itself demonstrates itself by so expressing and presenting itself. Thus, Dialectic is truly experienced when thought undergoes the incomprehensible reversal into its opposite. The very act of holding on to what consistently follows in the thought leads to this surprising movement of the reversal, as when, for example, a person seeking justice discovers that adhering strictly to the idea of justice becomes abstract and proves to be the greatest injustice. The highest right is the highest wrong. Hegel here distinguishes between the speculative and the dialectical. The dialectical is the expression of the speculative, the presentation of what is actually contained in the speculative, and to this extent it is the truly speculative. But since, as we have seen, the presentation is no adventitious activity, but the emergence of the thing itself, the philosophical proof itself belongs to the thing. It is true that it emerges, as we have seen, from a demand of ordinary thinking and imagining. Hence it is a presentation for the external reflection of understanding. But despite this, such a presentation is in fact by no means external. It considers itself such only as long as thought does not know that it proves finally to be the reflection of the thing in itself. Accordingly, Hegel emphasizes the difference between speculative and dialectical only in the preface to his Phenomenology. Because this distinction is in fact superseded, Hegel no longer retains it subsequently, from the viewpoint of absolute knowledge. This is the point at which the proximity of our own inquiry to the speculative dialectic of Plato and Hegel meets a fundamental barrier. The supersession of the distinction between speculative and dialectical that we find in Hegel's speculative science of the concept shows how much he considered himself as the heir to the Greek philosophy of the Logos. What he calls dialectic and what Plato called dialectic depends in fact on subordinating language to the statement. The concept of the statement, dialectically accentuated to the point of contradiction, however, is antithetical to the nature of hermeneutical experience and the verbal nature of human experience of the world. In fact, Hegel's dialectic also follows the speculative spirit of language, but according to Hegel's self-understanding, he is trying to take a hint from the way language playfully determines thought and to raise it by the mediation of the dialectic in the totality of known knowledge to the self-consciousness of the concept. In this respect, his dialectic remains within the dimension of statements and does not attain the dimension of the linguistic experience of the world. These are just a few indications of the way in which the dialectical nature of language pertains to the problems of hermeneutics. Language itself, however, has something speculative about it in a quite different sense, not only in the sense Hegel intends as an instinctive prefiguring of logical reflection, but rather as the realization of meaning, as the event of speech, of mediation, of coming to an understanding. Such a realization is speculative in that the finite possibilities of the word are oriented toward the sense intended as toward the infinite. A person who has something to say seeks and finds the words to make himself intelligible to the other person. This does not mean that he makes statements. Anyone who has experienced an interrogation, even if only as a witness, knows what it is to make a statement and how little it is a statement of what one means. In a statement, the horizon of meaning of what is to be said is concealed by methodical exactness. What remains is the pure sense of the statements. That is what goes on record. But meaning thus reduced to what is stated is always distorted meanings. To say what one means, on the other hand, to make oneself understood, means to hold what is said together with an infinity of what is not said in one unified meaning, and to ensure that it is understood in this way. Someone who speaks in this way may well use only the most ordinary and common words, and still be able to express what is unsaid and is to be said. Someone who speaks is behaving speculatively when his words do not reflect beings, but express a relation to the whole of being. This is connected with the fact that someone who repeats what is said, just like someone who takes down statements, does not need to distort consciously, and yet he will change the meaning of what is said. Even in the most everyday speech there appears an element of speculative reflection, namely, the intangibility of that which is still the purest reproduction of meaning. All this is epitomized in the poetic word. Here, of course, it is legitimate to see the actual reality of poetic speech in the poetic statement. For here it is really meaningful and necessary that the sense of the poetic word is expressed in what is said as such, without invoking the aid of occasional knowledge. If in the process of reaching understanding between people, the notion of the statement is distorted, here the concept of the statement achieves its fulfillment. The detachment of what is said from any subjective opinion and experience of the author constitutes the reality of the poetic word. But what does this statement state? It is clear, first of all, that everything that constitutes everyday speech can recur in the poetic word. If poetry shows people in conversation, then what is given in the poetic statement is not the statement that a written report would contain, but in a mysterious way the whole of the conversation is as if present. The words put into the mouth of a literary character are speculative in the same way that the speech of daily life is speculative. As we said above, in his speech the speaker expresses a relationship to being. Moreover, when we speak of a poetic statement, we do not mean the statement that is put into someone's mouth in a work of literature, but the statement that the work itself, as poetic word, is. But the poetic statement as such is speculative, in that the verbal event of the poetic word expresses its own relationship to being. If we take the poetic spirit's mode of proceeding, as, say, Hölderlin has described it, then it becomes immediately clear in what sense the verbal event of literature is speculative. Hölderlin has shown that finding the language of a poem involves totally dissolving all customary words and modes of expression. In that, the poet feels himself seized in his whole inner and outer life by the pure tone of his original sensation, and he looks about him in his world. It is new and unknown to him, the sum of all his experiences, his knowledge, his intuitions and memories, art and nature, as it presents itself within and without him. Everything is present to him as if for the first time, for this very reason ungrasped, undetermined, dissolved into sheer material and life. And it is supremely important that he does not at this moment accept anything as given, does not start from anything positive. That nature and art, as he has learned to know and see them, do not speak before a language is there for him. Note how close this is to Hegel's critique of positivity. As a successful work in creation, the poem is not the ideal but the spirit reawakened from infinite life. This is also reminiscent of Hegel. It does not describe or signify an entity, but opens up a world of the divine and the human for us. The poetic statement is speculative, inasmuch as it does not reflect an existent reality, does not reproduce the appearance of the species in the order of essence, but represents the new appearance of a new world in the imaginary medium of poetic invention. We have discerned the speculative structure of the event of language both in daily speech and poetic speech. The inner resemblance that thus appears, linking the poetic word with everyday speech as an intensification of the latter, has already been noted. From its subjective psychological side, in idealistic philosophy and its revival in Croce and Vossler. If we stress the other aspect, the fact of something's coming into language, as what really occurs in the event of language, we are preparing a place for the hermeneutical experience. As we have seen, the way tradition is understood and expressed ever anew in language is an event no less genuine than living conversation. What distinguishes them is only that the productivity of the verbal orientation to the world finds new application to an already verbally mediated content. The hermeneutical relation is a speculative relation, but it is fundamentally different from the dialectical self-unfolding of the mind, as described by Hegel's philosophical science. Since hermeneutic experience implies an event of language that corresponds to dialectical presentation in Hegel, it too partakes of dialectic, namely, the dialectic, elaborated above, of question and answer. As we have seen, the understanding of a traditionary text has an essential inner relationship to its interpretation, and although this is always a relative and incomplete movement, understanding still finds its relative fulfillment there. Accordingly, as Hegel teaches, the speculative content of a philosophical statement needs the corresponding dialectical presentation of the contradictions it contains if it is to become genuine science. There's a real correspondence here, for interpretation shares in the discursiveness of the human mind, which is able to conceive the unity of the object only in successiveness. Thus, interpretation has the dialectical structure of all finite historical being, insofar as every interpretation must begin somewhere and seeks to supersede the one-sidedness which that inevitably produces. It seems to the interpreter that some particular must necessarily be said and made explicit. All interpretation is motivated in this way and derives its significance from the context of its motivation. Through its one-sidedness, it puts too much emphasis on one side of the thing, so that something else has to be said to restore the balance. As philosophical dialectic presents the whole truth by superseding all partial propositions, bringing contradictions to a head and overcoming them, so also hermeneutics has the task of revealing a totality of meaning in all its relations. The individuality of the sense intended corresponds to the totality of all definitions. One thinks here of Schleiermacher, who based his dialectic on the metaphysics of individuality, and in his hermeneutical theory, constructed the process of interpretation from antithetical directions of thought. However, the correspondence between hermeneutical and philosophical dialectic, as it seems to follow from Schleiermacher's dialectical construction of individuality and Hegel's dialectical construction of totality, is not a real correspondence. For this parallel fails to take account of the real nature of the hermeneutic experience and the radical finitude that is its basis. It is true that interpretation has to start somewhere, but it does not start just anywhere. It is not really a beginning. We saw that the hermeneutical experience always includes the fact that the text to be understood speaks into a situation that is determined by previous opinions. The hermeneutical situation is not a regrettable distortion that affects the purity of understanding, but the condition of its possibility. Only because between the text and its interpreter there is no automatic accord can a hermeneutical experience make us share in the text. Only because a text has to be brought out of its alienness and assimilated is there anything for the person trying to understand it to say. Only because the text calls for it does interpretation take place, and only in the way called for. The apparently thetic beginning of interpretation is, in fact, a response, and the sense of an interpretation is determined, like every response, by the question asked. Thus, the dialectic of question and answer always precedes the dialectic of interpretation. It is what determines understanding as an event. From this it follows that hermeneutics cannot have any problem of a beginning, as the problem of the beginning of science is found in Hegel's logic. Wherever it arises, the problem of the beginning is, in fact, the problem of the end. For it is with respect to an end that a beginning is defined as a beginning of an end. Given infinite knowledge, given speculative dialectic, this may lead to the fundamentally unsolvable problem of what one is to start with. For every beginning is an end, and every end is a beginning. At any rate, given this kind of perfect circularity, the speculative question of the beginning of philosophical science is seen fundamentally in terms of its fulfillment. It is quite different with historically affected consciousness, in which hermeneutical experience reaches its consummation. It knows about the absolute openness of the event of meaning in which it shares. Here too, certainly, there is a standard by which understanding is measured, and which it can meet. The content of the tradition itself is the sole criterion, and it expresses itself in language. But there is no possible consciousness. We have repeatedly emphasized this, and it is the basis of the historicity of understanding. There is no possible consciousness, however infinite, in which any traditionary subject matter would appear in the light of eternity. Every appropriation of tradition is historically different, which does not mean that each one represents only an imperfect understanding of it. Rather, each is the experience of an aspect of the thing itself. The paradox that is true of all traditionary material, namely of being one and the same, and yet of being different, proves that all interpretation is, in fact, speculative. Hence, hermeneutics has to see through the dogmatism of a meaning in itself. In exactly the same way, critical philosophy has seen through the dogmatism of experience. This certainly does not mean that every interpreter considers himself speculative, i.e., he is conscious of the dogmatism contained in his own interpretative intention. What is meant, rather, is that all interpretation is speculative, as it is actually practiced, quite apart from its methodological self-consciousness. This is what emerges from the linguistic nature of interpretation. For the interpreting word is the word of the interpreter. It is not the language and the dictionary of the interpreted text. This means that assimilation is no mere reproduction or repetition of the traditionary text. It is a new creation of understanding. If emphasis has been rightly placed on the fact that all meaning is related to the I, this means, as far as the hermeneutical experience is concerned, that all the meaning of what is handed down to us finds its concretion, i.e., is understood, in its relation to the understanding I, and not in reconstructing the originally intending I. The intimate unity of understanding and interpretation is confirmed by the fact that the interpretation that reveals the implications of a text's meaning and brings it into language seems, when compared with the given text, to be a new creation, but yet does not maintain any proper existence apart from the understanding process. I have already pointed out above that the interpretive concepts are superseded in the fullness of understanding, because they are meant to disappear. This means that they are not just tools that we take up and then throw aside when we are done using them, but that they belong to the inner articulation of the subject matter, which is meaning. What is true of every word in which thought is expressed is true also of the interpreting word, namely that it is not, as such, objective, as the realization of the act of understanding it is the actuality of the historically affected consciousness. And as such, it is truly speculative, having no tangible being of its own, and yet reflecting the image that is presented to it. Compared with the immediacy of understanding between people, or the word of the poet, the language of the interpreter is undoubtedly a secondary phenomenon. It is language related again to language. And yet the language of the interpreter is at the same time the comprehensive manifestation of language, embracing all forms of language usage and structure. Our starting point was that understanding is inseparable from language, and that language is related to reason of every kind. And we can now see how the whole of our investigation is subsumed under this rubric. The development of the problem of hermeneutics from Schleiermacher through Dilthey to Husserl and Heidegger, which we have outlined, confirms from the historical side what we have now found to be the case, namely that philology's conceiving itself as a method raises a fundamental philosophical problem. The universal aspect of hermeneutics. Our inquiry has been guided by the basic idea that language is a medium where I and world meet, or rather manifest their original belonging together. We have also shown that this speculative medium that language is represents a finite process in contrast to the infinite dialectical mediation of concepts. In all the cases we analyzed, in the language of conversation, of poetry, and also of interpretation, the speculative structure of language emerged, not as the reflection of something given, but as the coming into language of a totality of meaning. This drew us toward the dialectic of the Greeks, because they did not conceive understanding as a methodic activity of the subject, but as something that the thing itself does, and which thought suffers. This activity of the thing itself is the real speculative movement that takes hold of the speaker. We have sought the subjective reflection of it in speech. We can now see that this activity of the thing itself, the coming into language of meaning, points to a universal ontological structure, namely to the basic nature of everything toward which understanding can be directed. Being that can be understood is language. The hermeneutical phenomenon here projects its own universality back onto the ontological constitution of what is understood, determining it in a universal sense as language and determining its own relation to beings as interpretation. Thus, we speak not only of a language of art, but also of a language of nature, in short of any language that things have. Above, we have already brought out the curious link between literary interpretation and the study of nature that accompanied the beginnings of modern science. Here we are getting to the foundations. It is not by accident that one could talk about the book of nature, which contained just as much truth as the book of books. That which can be understood is language. This means that it is of such a nature that of itself, it offers itself to be understood. Here too is confirmed the speculative structure of language. To come into language does not mean that a second being is acquired. Rather, what something presents itself as belongs to its own being. Thus, everything that is language has a speculative unity. It contains a distinction that between its being and its presentations of itself, but this is a distinction that is really not a distinction at all. The speculative mode of being of language has a universal ontological significance. To be sure, what comes into language is something different from the spoken word itself. But the word is a word only because of what comes into language in it. Its own physical being exists only in order to disappear into what is said. Likewise, that which comes into language is not something that is pre-given before language. Rather, the word gives it its own determinateness. We can now see that this speculative movement was what we were aiming at in the critique of both aesthetic and historical consciousness that introduced our analysis of hermeneutical experience. The being of the work of art is not a being in itself that is different from its reproduction or the contingency of its appearance. Only by a secondary thematization of the two things is it possible to make this kind of aesthetic differentiation. Similarly, whatever offers itself for our historical study from tradition or as tradition, the significance of an event or the meaning of a text is not a fixed object existing in itself, which we have simply to establish. In fact, historical consciousness too involves mediation between past and present. By seeing that language is the universal medium of this mediation, we were able to expand our inquiry from its starting point, the critiques of aesthetic and historical consciousness and the hermeneutics that would replace them, to universal dimensions. For man's relation to the world is absolutely and fundamentally verbal in nature, and hence intelligible. Thus hermeneutics is, as we have seen, a universal aspect of philosophy, and not just the methodological basis of the so-called human sciences. The objectifying procedures of natural science, and the concept of being in itself, which is intended in all knowledge, prove to be an abstraction when viewed from the medium that language is. Abstracted from the fundamental relation to the world that is given in the linguistic nature of our experience of it, science attempts to become certain about entities by methodically organizing its knowledge of the world. Consequently, it condemns as heresy all knowledge that does not allow of this kind of certainty and that therefore cannot serve the growing domination of being. By contrast, we have endeavored to liberate the mode of being of art and history, and the experience corresponding to them, from the ontological prejudice implied in the ideal of scientific objectivity. And, in view of the experience of art and history, we were led to a universal hermeneutics that was concerned with the general relationship of man to the world. We formulated this universal hermeneutics on the basis of the concept of language, not only in order to guard against a false obsession with method that infects the concept of objectivity in the human sciences, but also to avoid the idealistic spiritualism of a Hegelian metaphysics of infinity. The fundamental hermeneutical experience was articulated for us not merely by the tension between strangeness and familiarity, misunderstanding and correct understanding, such as dominated Schleiermacher's project. Rather, it was ultimately apparent that because of his doctrine that understanding is consummated in divination, Schleiermacher came close to Hegel. If we start from the fact that understanding is verbal, we are emphasizing, on the contrary, the finitude of the verbal event in which understanding is always in the process of being concretized. The language that things have, whatever kind of things they may be, is not the pure essence, and it is not fulfilled in the self-contemplation of an infinite intellect. It is the language that our finite historical nature apprehends when we learn to speak. This is true of the language of the texts handed down to us in tradition, and that is why it was necessary to have a truly historical hermeneutics. It is as true of the experience of art as of the experience of history. In fact, the concepts of art and history are modes of understanding that emerge from the universal mode of hermeneutical being as forms of hermeneutic experience. Obviously, it is not peculiar to the work of art that it has its being in its presentation, nor is it a peculiarity of the being of history that it is to be understood in its significance. Self-presentation and being understood belong together not only in that the one passes into the other, and the work of art is one with the history of its effects, and tradition is one with the present of its being understood. Speculative language, distinguishing itself from itself, presenting itself, language that expresses meaning is not only art and history but everything insofar as it can be understood. The speculative character of being that is the ground of hermeneutics has the same universality as do reason and language. With the ontological turn that our hermeneutical inquiry has taken, we are moving toward a metaphysical idea whose significance we can show by going back to its origins. The concept of the beautiful, which shared the central place in 18th century aesthetics with the sublime, and which was to be entirely eliminated in the course of the 19th century by the aesthetic critique of classicism, was once a universal metaphysical concept and had a function in metaphysics, the universal doctrine of being, that was by no means limited to the aesthetic in the narrower sense. We will see that this ancient conception of the beautiful can also be of service to the comprehensive hermeneutics that has emerged from the critique of an obsession with method in the human sciences. Even an analysis of the word's meaning shows that the concept of the beautiful has a close connection with the inquiry we have been pursuing. The Greek word for beautiful is kalon. There is no exact equivalent for this in German, not even if we use the Latin pulchrum as an intermediary term. But Greek thought in part determines the history of the meaning of the German word schön, so that the meanings of the two words overlap to some extent. Thus we say, for example, the fine arts. By adding the adjective fine, we distinguish these arts from what we call technology, i.e., from mechanical arts that make useful things. It is the same with phrases such as superior morality, high literature, the aesthetic. In all these usages, the word is in the same antithesis as is the Greek kalon to the idea of the useful. Everything that is not part of the necessities of life, but is concerned with the how, the living well, i.e., everything that the Greeks reckon part of education is called kalon. Beautiful things are those whose value is of itself evident. You cannot ask what purpose they serve. They are desirable for their own sake and not, like the useful, for the sake of something else. Thus, even linguistic usage shows the special status accorded to what is called kalon. But even the ordinary antithesis that determines the idea of the beautiful, the antithesis to the ugly, points in the same direction. The eiskron is what cannot be looked at. The beautiful is what can be looked at, what is good-looking in the widest sense of the word. In German ansehnlich, good-looking, is also used to express magnitude. And in fact, the use of the word schön, both in Greek and in German, always implies a certain majestic size. Because the element of the good-looking points to the whole sphere of the decor, the proper, the moral, its meaning comes close to being defined by its antithesis to the useful. Hence the idea of the beautiful closely approximates that of the good, insofar as it is something to be chosen for its own sake, as an end that subordinates everything else to it as a means. For what is beautiful is not regarded as a means to something else. Thus, Platonic philosophy exhibits a close connection, and sometimes even a confusion, between the idea of the good and the idea of the beautiful. Both transcend everything that is conditional and multiform. The loving soul encounters the beautiful in itself at the end of a path that leads through the beautiful that is multiform. The beautiful in itself is the one, the uniform, the boundless, symposium, just like the idea of the good that lies beyond everything that is conditional and multiform, i.e., good only in a certain respect, republic. The beautiful in itself shows itself to be as much beyond all beings as is the good in itself. Thus, the order of being that consists in the orientation toward the one good agrees with the order of the beautiful. The path of love that Diotima teaches leads beyond beautiful bodies to beautiful souls, and from there to beautiful institutions, customs, and laws, and finally to the sciences, e.g. to the beautiful relations of numbers found in mathematics, to this wide ocean of beautiful utterance, and leads beyond all that. We may ask whether the movement beyond the sphere of what is perceptually visible into that of the intelligible really involves a differentiation and increase of the beauty of the beautiful, and not just of the being that is beautiful. But Plato obviously means that the teleological order of being is also an order of beauty, that beauty appears more purely and clearly in the sphere of the intelligible than in that of the visible, which is muddied by the inharmonious and the imperfect. Similarly, medieval philosophy linked the idea of the beautiful so closely with that of the good, the bonum, that it failed to understand a classical passage from Aristotle on the kalon. The translation here simply rendered the word kalon as bonum. The basis of the close connection between the idea of the beautiful and that of the ideological order of being is the Pythagorean and Platonic concept of measure. Plato defines the beautiful in terms of measure, appropriateness, and right proportions. And Aristotle states that the elements of the beautiful are order, right proportions, and definition, and he finds these paradigmatically exemplified in mathematics. Further, the close connection between the mathematical orders of the beautiful and the order of the heavens means that the cosmos, the model of all visible harmony, is at the same time the supreme example of beauty in the visible sphere. Harmonious proportion symmetry is the decisive condition of all beauty. As we can see, this kind of definition of the beautiful is a universal ontological one. Here, nature and art are not in antithesis to each other. This means, of course, that in regard to beauty, the priority of nature is unquestioned. Art may take advantage of gaps in the natural order of being to perfect its beauties. But that certainly does not mean that beauty is to be found primarily in art. As long as the order of being is itself seen as divine or as God's creation, and the latter is the case until the 18th century, the exceptional case of art can be seen only within the horizon of this order of being. We have described above how it was only in the 19th century that the problems of aesthetics were transferred to art. We can now see that there was a metaphysical process behind this. This switch to the point of view of art ontologically presupposes a mass of being thought of as formless or ruled by mechanical laws. The artistic mind of man, which mechanically constructs useful things, will ultimately understand all beauty in terms of the work of his own mind. Accordingly, only at the frontiers of the mechanical constructibility of being has modern science been reminded of the independent ontological value of the Gestalt, and now introduces the idea of the Gestalt as a supplementary principle of knowledge into the explanation of nature, chiefly into the explanation of living nature, biology, and psychology. This does not mean science abandons its fundamental attitude, but only that it tries to reach its goal, the domination of being, in a more subtle way. This must be emphasized against the self-conception of modern natural science. At the same time, however, science accepts the beauty of nature, the beauty of art, and the disinterested pleasure they give, but only at its own frontiers, the frontiers of the achieved domination of nature. When describing the reversal of the relationship between the beauty of nature and the beauty of art, we discussed the shift whereby the beauty of nature finally lost its priority to such an extent that it is conceived as a reflection of the mind. We might have added that nature came to be conceived in the way it has been ever since Rousseau, as the mirror image of the concept of art. As the counterpart of the mind, as the non-if, nature became a polemical concept, and as such it has none of the universal ontological dignity possessed by the cosmos, the order of beautiful things. Certainly no one will want simply to reverse this development and try to re-establish the metaphysical dignity of the beautiful that we find in Greek philosophy by reviving the last embodiment of this tradition, the 18th century aesthetics of perfection. However unsatisfactory is the development of aesthetics toward subjectivism that began with Kant, he has convincingly proved the untenability of aesthetic rationalism. Still, it is incorrect to base the metaphysics of the beautiful solely on the ontology of measure and the teleological order of being to which the rationalist aesthetic of rules, which seems so classical, ultimately appeals. The metaphysics of the beautiful is not, in fact, identical to this application of aesthetic rationalism. The return to Plato brings out quite a different aspect of the phenomenon of the beautiful, and this is what is of interest in our hermeneutical inquiry. However closely Plato has linked the idea of the beautiful with that of the good, he is still aware of a difference between the two, and this difference involves the special advantage of the beautiful. We have seen that the intangibility of the good finds an analog in the beautiful, i.e., in the harmony between the thing and its attendant disclosure, aletheia, in that it too has an ultimate manifest brilliance. But Plato can say, moreover, that in the attempt to grasp the good itself, the good takes flight into the beautiful. Thus, the beautiful is distinguished from the absolutely intangible good in that it can be grasped. It is part of its own nature to be something that is visibly manifest. The beautiful reveals itself in the search for the good. It is the mark distinguishing the good for the human soul. That which manifests itself in perfect form attracts the longing of love to it. The beautiful disposes people in its favor immediately, whereas models of human virtue can be only obscurely described in the unclear medium of appearances, because they have, as it were, no light of their own. Thus, we often succumb to impure imitations and appearances of virtue. The case of the beautiful is different. It has its own radiance, so that we are not seduced here by deceptive copies. For beauty alone has this quality, that it is what is most radiant and lovely. Through the anagogical function of the beautiful, which Plato has described in unforgettable terms, a structural characteristic of the being of the beautiful becomes visible, and with it an element of the structure of being in general. Obviously, what distinguishes the beautiful from the good is that the beautiful of itself presents itself, that its being is such that it makes itself immediately evident. This means that beauty has the most important ontological function, that of mediating between idea and appearance. This is the metaphysical crux of Platonism. It finds its concrete form in the concept of participation and concerns both the relation of the appearance to the idea and the relation of the ideas to one another. As we learn from the Phaedrus, it is not accidental that Plato likes to illustrate this controversial relation of participation by the example of the beautiful. The idea of the beautiful is truly present, whole and undivided, in what is beautiful. Hence, through the example of the beautiful, the parousia, or presence, of the eidos that Plato has in mind can be made evident, and by contrast to the logical difficulties of participation in the being of becoming, the thing itself can be offered in evidence. Being present belongs in a convincing way to the being of the beautiful itself. However, much beauty might be experienced as the reflection of something supra-terrestrial. It is still there in the visible world. That it really is something different, a being of another order, is seen in its mode of appearance. It appears suddenly, and just as suddenly, without any transition, it disappears again. If we must speak with Plato of a hiatus between the world of the senses and the world of ideas, this is where it is, and this is where it is also overcome. The beautiful appears not only in what is visibly present to the senses, but it does so in such a way that it really exists only through it, i.e., emerges as one out of the whole. The beautiful is of itself truly most radiant. The sharp division between the beautiful and what has no share in the beautiful is, moreover, a fact that is well established phenomenologically. Aristotle says of well-formed works that nothing can be added to them and nothing taken away. The sensible mean exactness of proportion is part of the oldest definition of the beautiful. We need only think of the sensitivity to the tonal harmonies from which music is constructed. Radiance, then, is not only one of the qualities of the beautiful, but constitutes its actual being. The distinguishing mark of the beautiful, namely that it immediately attracts the desire of the human soul to it, is founded in its mode of being. The proportionality of the thing does not simply let it be what it is, but also causes it to emerge as a harmonious whole that is proportioned within itself. This is the disclosure of which Plato speaks in the Philebus, and which is part of the nature of the beautiful. Beauty is not simply symmetry, but appearance itself. It is related to the idea of shining. To shine means to shine on something, and so to make that on which the light falls appear. Beauty has the mode of being of light. This means not only that without light nothing beautiful can appear, nothing can be beautiful. It also means that the beauty of a beautiful thing appears in it as light, as a radiance. It makes itself manifest. In fact, the universal mode of being of light is to be reflected in itself in this way. Light is not only the brightness of that on which it shines. By making something else visible, it is visible itself, and it is not visible in any other way than by making something else visible. The reflective nature of light was already brought out in classical thought, and correlatively the idea of reflection that plays such an important role in modern philosophy originally belongs to the sphere of optics. Obviously, it is because of its reflective nature that light combines seeing and the visible, so that without light there can be neither seeing nor anything visible. We recognize the consequences of this trivial observation when we consider the relation of light to the beautiful and the extent of the meaning covered by the beautiful. It is actually light that makes visible things into shapes that are both beautiful and good. But the beautiful is not limited to the sphere of the visible. It is, as we saw, the mode of appearance of the good in general, of being as it ought to be. The light in which not only the realm of the visible, but also that of the intelligible is articulated, is not the light of the sun, but the light of the mind, of nous. Plato's profound analogy already alluded to this. From it, Aristotle developed the doctrine of nous, and following him, medieval Christian thought developed that of the active intellect. The mind that unfolds from within itself, the multiplicity of what is thought is present to itself in what is thought. The Christian doctrine of the creative word, which we have considered at some length above, follows the Platonic and Neoplatonic metaphysics of light. We have described the ontological structure of the beautiful as the mode of appearing that causes things to emerge in their proportions and their outline, and the same holds for the realm of the intelligible. The light that causes everything to emerge in such a way that it is evident and comprehensible in itself is the light of the Word. Thus, the close relationship that exists between the shining forth of the beautiful and the self-evidence of the understandable is based on the metaphysics of light. This was precisely the relation that guided our hermeneutical inquiry. The reader will recall that the analysis of the nature of the work of art led to the question of hermeneutics, and that this expanded into a universal inquiry. All this took place without any reference to the metaphysics of light. If we now consider the connection between the latter and our inquiry, we are helped by the fact that the structure of light can obviously be detached from the Neoplatonic and Christian metaphysical theory of the at once sensible and intellectual source of light. This is already clear from Augustine's dogmatic interpretation of the creation story. Augustine notes that light is created before the differentiation of things and the creation of the light-giving heavenly bodies. But he puts special emphasis on the fact that the first creation of heaven and earth takes place without the divine word. Only when light is created does God speak for the first time. Augustine interprets this speech, by means of which light is commanded and created, as the coming into being of mental light, by means of which the difference among created things is made possible. It is only through light that the formlessness of the first created mass of heaven and earth is rendered capable of being shaped into a multiplicity of forms. In Augustine's ingenious interpretation of Genesis, we can discern the first hint of the speculative interpretation of language that we have elaborated in the structural analysis of the hermeneutical experience of the world, according to which the multiplicity of what is thought proceeds only from the unity of the word. We can also see that the metaphysics of light brings out a side of the classical concept of the beautiful that is justified apart from the context of substance metaphysics and the metaphysical relationship to the infinite divine mind. Thus, our analysis of the place of the beautiful in classical Greek philosophy shows that this aspect of metaphysics has a productive significance for us also. That being is self-presentation, and that all understanding is an event. This first and last insight transcends the horizon of substance metaphysics, as well as the metamorphosis of the concept of substance into the concepts of subjectivity and scientific objectivity. Thus, the metaphysics of the beautiful has implications for our inquiry. Now it is no longer a question, as it seemed in the 19th century, of justifying the truth claim of art and the artistic, or even that of history and the methodology of the human sciences, in terms of theory of science. Now we are concerned, rather, with the much more general task of establishing the ontological background of the hermeneutical experience of the world. The metaphysics of the beautiful can be used to illuminate 2 points that follow from the relation between the radiance of the beautiful and the self-evidence of the intelligible. The first is that both the appearance of the beautiful and the mode of being of understanding have the character of an event. The second, that the hermeneutical experience, as the experience of traditionary meaning, has a share in the immediacy which has always distinguished the experience of the beautiful, as it has that of all evidence of truth. 1. First, against the background of traditional speculation on light and beauty, let us justify our assigning primacy to the activity of the thing in hermeneutical experience. It is now clear that we are not concerned here with either mythology or a mere dialectical reversal in the manner of Hegel, but with the continuing influence of an ancient truth that has been able to assert itself against modern scientific methodology. This is seen from the very etymology of the concepts we use. We have said that, like everything meaningful, the beautiful is clearly evident, shining in. This concept of self-evident belongs to the tradition of rhetoric. The plausible, the verisimilar, the probable, true shining, the evident, belong in a series of things that defend their rightness against the truth and certainty of what is proved and known. Let us recall that we assigned a special importance to the sensus communis. Also, there may be an echo of the mystical, pietistic-sounding illuminatio, illumination in the idea of an echo that can also be heard in the sensus communis. At any rate, it is not by chance that the metaphor of light is used in both spheres. The thing itself compels us to speak of an event and of an activity of the thing. What is evident is always something that is said, a proposal, a plan, a conjecture, an argument, or something of the sort. The idea is always that what is evident has not been proved and is not absolutely certain, but it asserts itself by reason of its own merit within the realm of the possible and probable. Thus we can even admit that an argument has something evidently true about it, even though we are presenting a counter-argument. How it is to be reconciled with the whole of what we ourselves consider correct is left open. It is only said that it is evident in itself, i.e., that there is something in its favor. The connection with the beautiful is manifest. The beautiful charms us, without its being immediately integrated with the whole of our orientations and evaluations. Indeed, just as the beautiful is a kind of experience that stands out like an enchantment and an adventure within the whole of our experience and presents a special task of hermeneutical integration, what is evident is always something surprising as well, like a new light being turned on, expanding the range of what we can take into consideration. The hermeneutical experience belongs in this sphere because it too is the event of a genuine experience. This is in fact always the case when something speaks to us from tradition. There is something evident about what is said, though that does not imply it is, in every detail, secured, judged, and decided. The tradition asserts its own truth in being understood, and disturbs the horizon that had, until then, surrounded us. It is a real experience in the sense we have shown. The event of the beautiful and the hermeneutical process both presuppose the finiteness of human life. We might even ask whether the beautiful can be experienced by an infinite mind, in the same way that it can be by us. Can this mind see anything other than the beauty of the whole that lies before it? The radiance of the beautiful seems to be something reserved to finite human experience. There was a similar problem in medieval thought, namely how beauty can be in God if he is one and not many. Only Nicholas of Cusa's theory of the complicatio of the many in God offers a satisfactory solution. From this, it seems to follow that, as in Hegel's philosophy of infinite knowledge, art is a form of representation that is superseded in the concept and in philosophy. Similarly, the universality of the hermeneutical experience would not be available to an infinite mind, for it develops out of itself all meaning, all intelligible content, and thinks all that can be thought in the perfect contemplation of itself. The God of Aristotle, as well as the spirit of Hegel, has left philosophy, this movement of finite existence, behind. None of the gods philosophizes, says Plato. The fact that we have been able to refer several times to Plato, even though Greek logos philosophy revealed the ground of hermeneutical experience only in a very fragmentary way, is due to this feature of the Platonic view of beauty, which is like an undercurrent in the history of Aristotelian and scholastic metaphysics, sometimes rising to the surface, as in Neoplatonic and Christian mysticism and in theological and philosophical spiritualism. It was in this tradition of Platonism that the conceptual vocabulary required for thought about the finiteness of human life was developed. The continuity of this Platonic tradition is attested by the affinity between the Platonic theory of beauty and the idea of a universal hermeneutics. 2. If we start from the basic ontological view that being is language, i.e., self-presentation, as revealed to us by the hermeneutical experience of being, then there follows not only the event character of the beautiful and the event structure of all understanding. Just as the mode of being of the beautiful proved to be characteristic of being in general, so the same thing can be shown to be true of the concept of truth. We can start from the metaphysical tradition, but here too we must ask what aspects of it apply to hermeneutical experience. According to traditional metaphysics, the truth of what exists is one of its transcendental qualities and is closely related to goodness, which again brings in beauty. Thus, we may recall St. Thomas's statement that the beautiful is to be defined in terms of knowledge, the good in terms of desire. The beautiful is that in the vision of which desire comes to rest, whose very apprehension pleases. The beautiful has an orientation not only toward goodness, but towards the cognitive faculty. He adds above all a certain well-orderedness to the cognitive faculty. The radiance of the beautiful appears here like a light that shines over what is formed, a light that shines above form itself. By again appealing to Plato, we can again attempt to free this statement from its connection to the metaphysical doctrine of the forms. Plato was the first to show that the essential element in the beautiful was aletheia, and it is clear what he means by this. The beautiful, the way in which goodness appears, reveals itself in its being. It presents itself. What presents itself in this way is not different from itself in presenting itself. It is not one thing for itself and another for others, nor is it something that exists through something else. Beauty is not radiance shed on a form from without. Rather, the ontological constitution of the form itself is to be radiant, to present itself in this way. From this, then, it follows that in regard to beauty, the beautiful must always be understood ontologically as an image. It makes no difference whether it itself or its copy appears. As we have seen, the metaphysical distinction of the beautiful was that it closed the gap between the idea and the appearance. It is certainly an idea, i.e., it belongs to an order of being that rises above the flux of appearances as something constant in itself. But equally certain is that it is itself that appears. As we saw, this is by no means an objection to the doctrine of ideas, but the concentrated exemplification of its problem. Where Plato appeals to the self-evidence of the beautiful, he does not need to insist on the contrast between the thing itself and its copy. It is the beautiful itself that both creates and supersedes this contrast. Plato is likewise important for the problem of truth. In analyzing the work of art, we have endeavored to show that self-presentation is to be regarded as the true being of the work of art. To this end, we invoked the concept of play, and this directed us into more general contexts. For we saw there that the truth of what presents itself in play is properly neither believed nor not believed outside the play situation. In the aesthetic sphere, this is obvious. Even when the poet is honored as a seer, his poetry, e.g. Hölderlin's song of the return of the gods, is not actually regarded as a prophecy. Rather, the poet is a seer because he himself presents what is, was, and will be, and hence he himself attests to what he proclaims. It is true that poetic utterance has something ambiguous about it, like an oracle. But this is precisely where its hermeneutical truth lies. If we regard it as something that is simply aesthetic, non-binding, and lacking in existential seriousness, we are obviously failing to see how fundamental is the finitude of man for the hermeneutical experience of the world. It is not the weakness but the strength of the oracle that it is ambiguous. Whoever would put Hölderlin or Rilke to the proof to see if they really believe in their gods or angels is missing the point. Kant's fundamental definition of aesthetic pleasure, as disinterested pleasure, has not only the negative implication that the pleasurable object cannot be employed as something useful or desired as something good, but also the positive one that really existing can add nothing to the aesthetic content of pleasure, to the sheer sight of a thing, because aesthetic being is, precisely, self-presentation. Only from the moral standpoint is there an interest in the real, factual existence of the beautiful, e.g. in the Song of the Nightingale, the imitation of which was, for Kant, somehow morally offensive. Whether, from the fact that aesthetic being is so constituted, it really follows that truth must not be sought here because nothing is known here, is the question. In our analyses of the aesthetic, we discussed the narrowness of the concept of knowledge that limited Kant's position in this matter, and from the question of the truth of art, we found our way into hermeneutics, where art and history were combined for us. Even with regard to the hermeneutical phenomenon, it seemed an unjustified limitation to regard the process of understanding solely as the imminent effort of a philological consciousness that is indifferent to the truth of its texts. On the other hand, it was clear that the understanding of texts did not mean that the question of truth was decided in advance from the standpoint of a superior knowledge of the subject matter, or that in understanding one was enjoying one's own superior knowledge of the object. Rather, the whole value of hermeneutical experience, like the significance of history for human knowledge in general, seemed to consist in the fact that here we are not simply filing things in pigeonholes, but that what we encounter in a tradition says something to us. Understanding, then, does not consist in a technical virtuosity of understanding everything written. Rather, it is a genuine experience, i.e., an encounter with something that asserts itself as truth. The fact that such an encounter takes place in verbal interpretation, for reasons we have discussed, and that the phenomenon of language and understanding proves to be a universal model of being and knowledge in general, enables us to define more exactly the meaning of the truth at play in understanding. We have seen that the words that bring something into language are themselves a speculative event. Their truth lies in what is said in them, and not in an intention locked in the impotence of subjective particularity. Let us remember that understanding what someone says is not an achievement of empathy in which one divines the inner life of the speaker. Certainly it is true of all understanding that what is said acquires its determinacy, in part through a supplementing of meaning from occasional sources. But this determination by situation and context, which fills out what is said to a totality of meaning and makes what is said really said, pertains not to the speaker but to what is spoken. Accordingly, poetic utterance proved to be the special case of a meaning that has dissolved into and been embodied in the utterance. The coming into language that occurs in a poem is like entering into relationships of order that support and guarantee the truth of what is said. all coming into language, and not just the poetic, has about it something of this quality of self-attestation. Where the word breaks off, no thing may be. As we emphasized, speaking is never just subsuming individual things under universal concepts. In using words, what is given to the senses is not put at our disposal as an individual case of a universal. It is itself made present in what is said, just as the idea of the beautiful is present in what is beautiful. What we mean by truth here can best be defined again in terms of our concept of play. The weight of the things we encounter in understanding plays itself out in a linguistic event, a play of words playing around and about what is meant. Language games exist where we, as learners, and when do we cease to be that, rise to the understanding of the world. Here it is worth recalling what we said about the nature of play, namely that the player's actions should not be considered subjective actions, since it is, rather, the game itself that plays, for it draws the players into itself, and thus itself becomes the actual subjectum, the authentic agent of the playing. The analog in the present case is neither playing with language nor with the contents of the experience of the world or of tradition that speak to us, but the play of language itself, which addresses us, proposes and withdraws, asks and fulfills itself in the answer. Thus, understanding is not playing, in the sense that the person understanding playfully holds himself back and refuses to take a stand with respect to the claim made on him. The freedom of self-possession necessary for one to withhold oneself in this way is not given here, and this, in fact, is what applying the concept of play to understanding implies. Someone who understands is always already drawn into an event through which meaning asserts itself. So it is well-founded for us to use the same concept of play for the hermeneutical phenomenon as for the experience of the beautiful. When we understand a text, what is meaningful in it captivates us, just as the beautiful captivates us. It has asserted itself and captivated us before we can come to ourselves and be in a position to test the claim to meaning that it makes. What we encounter in the experience of the beautiful and in understanding the meaning of tradition really has something of the truth of play about it. In understanding, we are drawn into an event of truth and arrive, as it were, too late, if we want to know what we are supposed to believe. Thus, there is undoubtedly no understanding that is free of all prejudices, however much the will of our knowledge must be directed toward escaping their thrall. Throughout our investigation, it has emerged that the certainty achieved by using scientific methods does not suffice to guarantee truth. This especially applies to the human sciences, but it does not mean that they are less scientific. On the contrary, it justifies the claim to special humane significance that they have always made. The fact that in such knowledge the knower's own being comes into play certainly shows the limits of method, but not of science. Rather, what the tool of method does not achieve must, and really can, be achieved by a discipline of questioning and inquiring, a discipline that guarantees truth.